Hello everyone, John here, and today I will be doing a Unit 1 recap for American government. Let's get started, shall we? I'll be talking about Chapter 1, 2, and 3, along with the development of the U.S. Constitution. Chapter 1, the Democratic Republic. What are the different forms of government? Totalitarian regime, an authoritarian government, and a democracy. A totalitarian is a type of government like a socialist society where government is involved in every aspect of your life. No one is safe and no one wants that. Everyone wants a little bit of privacy. The second is an authoritarian government. This is based off a strong central power with lower individuals giving up their political freedoms by choice. The last is a democracy, where the people hold the power and choose whether to rule directly or be represented by others. What are the principles of a democracy? There are four main principles: universal suffrage, the majority rule, a constitutional democracy, and limited power towards the government. What are the types of democracy? There's a direct and a indirect, or representative. In a direct, people choose whether to rule directly. That means they have just as much power as the government in terms of political power. A representative is where people decide to elect an individual or group of people to represent them. Therefore, the representatives decide on their behalf. Now, what are the pros and cons of a direct and indirect democracy? Let's start with the direct. Now, the pros is that every vote counts. You get complete, accurate, straightforward info from the government to the people. There's more cooperation in between the societal demographics, and if they don't like the government officials, they can immediately recall them and re-elect someone else. However, though, there's difficult decision making, more segregation between these demographics. Not everyone chooses to participate. It can be quite expensive, and there's extreme manipulation. Now, what about the representative or indirect democracy? The good thing is they have an efficient executive, people like the officials, there's better representation, and is easier to address problems, along with the fact that it encourages participation. However, the trust is misplaced. The representatives don't represent well. It encourages deceptiveness. It still has the majority rule in place, and there's no accountability for these elected officials. Now, let's talk about majoritarianism, elite theory, and pluralism. Now, you might be asking yourself, what are these and what do they mean? These words are the different types of democracy a government may want to develop. These may even have similar concepts to other words that may deal with different types of government. Majoritarianism. This is where the people, or majority, gets control. It's like the middle school definition of democracy because everyone, including the minorities in these societal demographics, will be able to have just as much political power as the government. To think of this, think of the major part as the majority. Next up, let's talk about elite theory. This democracy is one ruled by a group of individuals. These individuals have the power to make decisions that end up having a good or bad effect on society. It's somewhat like an oligarchy, where one or more person can rule. Think of the elite part as those who are worthy, like people worthy to be part of the group to rule. Last is pluralism. This is a different kind of government, to say the least. It's like elite theory, but multiple groups are in role. We can think of the poor word as multiple, like multiple groups. Each group has different interests in mind, so they represent a certain demographic. Now let's talk about the three fundamental values: order, equality, and liberty. Order is a fundamental idea that is valued by those that need order. Therefore, things are organized, stuff is done on schedule, and regulations are ensured to keep things under control. People that value this give up some of their liberties and equalities in order to keep things stable. Let's say a celebrity makes a deal with the president. The celebrity gives up going out on clubs on a specific day to promote the president's campaign, and as a result, they get protection from a few of the president's bodyguards. Equality. This is a very hard value to define. It's basically where everyone gets the same treatment and hospitality. Unfortunately, it's never equal because there will always be people that end up wanting more, therefore hurting someone else's benefits and disturbing that equality. Let's say, for example, 6 students are a part of a club that gives rewards. The club decides to throw a pizza party and decides to have one pizza cut into 6 pieces. 4 out of the 6 students have a slice, while one of them gets 2. That one ends up hurting the only student that gets none. Last but not least is liberty. This fundamental concept is valued by those who want to do or say what they want without any kind of restraint or repercussion. An example of this is like a group of students. Each of them discuss a point of view of their own without anyone or anything holding them back. John Stuart Mill defined liberty as the freedom to act in the absence of using violence for persuasion. Article 5 in the Human Rights Act was mainly the right to liberty and security. This was important for those in immigration detention and the criminal justice system, and those detained by mental health laws. Now let's talk about the different conflicts between these values: liberty and order. Say, for example, people want more freedom on what they say or do over government regulations and security. But if you have freedom to steal something, people will be stealing from each other for many crazy reasons. The government is here to not let that happen and punish those who steal things they don't own or deserve. Now let's take into account order versus equality. Some people will like some security regulations on certain things, while these might be challenged by those who want equality. For example, segregation. People back then went to separate schools based on color. Those who were in favor of this wanted order, but those who were unable to go to the schools they wanted equality. Now, what about liberty against equality? Some individuals wanted more freedom. Giving one person freedom can end up being a loss in freedom for others. Say, for example, let's say producers want more freedom, but doesn't realize it hurts the freedom of the competition around them. That could disturb the market. Now, let's get into the political ideologies. First one is conservatism. This ideology is where someone commits to the old traditions and rejects change. Modern conservatism was an ideology that leans a little off traditions and more towards change, but only to improve the well-being of those traditions. The conservative movement was a point in time where the Republican Party control has been taken by people with strong feelings for strong national defense, low taxes, little to no government regulation, and traditional social values. A conservative values placing ideas and principles over one's personal desires, weaknesses, fears, and regrets. Now, what about liberalism? This political idea is where one is respectful and open to others' ideas and perspectives. In modern liberalism, it was mainly for using the state for the society's benefit. It's generally associated with social welfare programs and many other means that support society through different programs. These type of people value individualism, rationalism, responsibility, freedom, justice, and tolerance. Now, let's talk about the political spectrum in between socialism and libertarianism. Socialism is an idea where the community owns and regulates the, the production, distribution, and exchange of the market as a whole. Libertarianism is where the government does little to nothing in the free market and their citizens' personal lives. Now, what are the concerns about liberalism? Well, on the left side, they think that it's a stand in for the ways of global capitalism to ruin the democracy. On the right hand side, it's an example of political order tearing apart families, tradition, and community. Now, where's socialism on this perspective? How much power do they have? Major economic control. That means to control everything in the market. What should the government promote? Maybe more equality in the community coming together. Liberalism. They have just enough power to make a positive impact on the economic market. What should be promoted? Economic security, social liberty, and equal opportunity. Conservatism? Just as much power as liberalism, but it was only to support capitalism. What should be promoted? Social order, morality, and economic liberty. What about libertarianism? The government has little to no power, meaning there is little to no regulations. What should be promoted? Complete economic and social liberty. Now, let's talk about the development of the U.S. Constitution. Let's start how the colonies went from separate states to joining together as a continental congress. Now, there have been certain circumstances where self-governance has been shown. Jamestown creating a representing assembly for those that will represent the population. The New England settlers in an agreement in authority and legitimacy known as the Mayflower Compact. And as more colonies were made, each one created their own government and laws. Now, the key factors of why these were important was the fact that the assembly started a certain set of indirect democracy rules. It highlighted the fact that colonies would still locally obey the central government. It showed popular sovereignty. It was a reference point for future governing effort, and the colonists began to develop an attitude towards limiting the government. Now, what were the challenges these colonies had? Well, their location, their practices versus their theoretical rule under the crown, and the security. Now, the distance between the colonies of Great Britain created many problems. Although the colonies governed themselves in practice, they were still theoretically under the rule of Great Britain. And there were times where Great Britain were unable to protect their colonies, leaving the colonies no choice but to create their own form of security. Now, let's go on to part 2 of their challenges, the French and Indian War. This war laid the foundation for future challenges for the colonies and Great Britain. It started in 1756 and ended in 1763. Both the colonies and Great Britain wanted to make an agreement with the natives, and since the French had more connections with the natives, most of the battles between the two ended up tipping in their favor. William Pitt, the British State Secretary, took over Great Britain's war and heavily borrowed to ensure access. Great Britain finally gained control of Canada and all land eastward of the Mississippi River. They were in debt at the end of the war. Now, here are the reasons why the 7 Years' War was consequential. It was a trigger for actions that impacted the alliance between the colonies and the Crown. It served as military training for George Washington for the future war known as the Revolutionary War. And it made an ally with the new country whose cooperation would assist the U.S. in gaining independence. Now, Britain needed money for the debt, therefore taxing the colonies they defended to help pay for the costs needed. Therefore, they enacted the Sugar Act, Currency Act, Quartering Act, and Stamp Act. With the number of taxes given to the colonies, with the Stamp Act being the last straw, they reacted by creating the Stamp Act Progress, which gave birth to the motto, "No taxation without representation." They rejected all English products as a response to these new acts, and decided to draft a document that railed against all oppressive British policies known as the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. Knowing that enforcing the Stamp Act is more costly than removing it, they decided to abolish it the following year. However, the quarrel over this act planted seeds for bigger movement against the British and the fateful battle that will determine the independence of the United States. Later, the British decided to enact the Coercive Acts as a result of the Boston Tea Party protests, therefore closing Boston Harbor and placed Massachusetts under direct British control. Now let's talk about how the Continental Congress created a confederation. Now, the Continental Congress was formed in 1774. It served as the colony's government, also known as the United States, and established the United States as an independent nation. They drafted the Articles of Confederation 3 years later, in 1777. Unfortunately, a weak government was established that did little to keep the peace and order. It was redrafted and known as the United States Constitution. It made a strong government, ratified in 1788, and the Bill of Rights was added and ratified in 1791. Now it was time for the call of change. At the end of the war, the Confederate United States still held on to the issues of a weak central government, therefore causing states to argue with one another and increasing the tax on each other's goods and services. It also caused an economic depression, which banks decided to call on old loans and reject new ones because of a lack of central control. And people were being thrown into prison because they were in debt. Although Sherman's rebellion, where armed farmers controlled courthouses and stopped the debtors' trials, was dealt with, it was a key point in giving a sign for the Articles Reconstruction and spark an action for new national leaders. However, Before a convention was called in May 1787, two factions were already in control of the plans. The Federalists were those who felt that the current government had weaknesses which threatened the country's survival, and the Anti-Federalists were those who were in favor of a weak central government. Now, these two factions had interests that conflicted with each other. One was a strong central monarchy. A second one was a strong central republic-founded government with the support of the people. And a third was an assignment of the western lands. Both these factions were driven by location, population, and the status of the free enslaved slaves. Now let's talk about the plans and compromises. First up is the Virginia Plan. This is favored by large and populous states. They wanted to institute a bicameral legislature where the lower chamber is elected by the people and the upper chamber is elected by the nominees selected by the people. Creates a national executive elected by the legislator and creates a national coin appointed by that same legislator. The New Jersey Plan, which is favored by small states, said to keep the one state, one vote mode of operation. All acts of Congress be the supreme law of the land. Congress would elect several people to form executive office, and that executive office would appoint a Supreme Court. Now, it's time for the Connecticut Compromise, where they institute a bicameral legislature, where the lower chamber is based off the state's population, and the upper chamber is equally proportioned. The Slavery Compromises is with the 3/5 Compromise, the lower chamber representing counts slaves as 3/5 of a free person. The slave trade, where Congress would not be permitted to restrict slave trading until 1808, and the Fugitive Slave Clause, where it permits escaped slaves to be returned. Now, the Madisonian model created something known as the checks and balances, where not one part of the branch has more power over the other. It created three branches: the legislative, executive, and judicial. Next step is the fights for ratification, the Federalists against the Anti-Federalists. Now, the delegates approved the Constitution in September 1787. For it to take effect, it had to be ratified by 9 of the 13 states. Both the Federalists and Anti-Federalists were battling over the ratification of these. Now, for the Anti-Federalists in U.S. history, the Anti-Federalists were those who were opposed the development of a strong federal government and a ratification of the Constitution in 1788, referring instead that the power remained in the hands of the state and local governments, therefore making it a confederate. However, the Federalists wanted a stronger national government and the ratification of the U.S. Constitution to help properly manage the debt and tensions following the American Revolution. Therefore, they wanted it to be a unitary. The Anti-Federalists had support of people who mainly lived in rural areas, while the Federalists had support from people in urban areas. The Anti-Federalists was opposed on the Constitution until they included the Bill of Rights to help secure their liberties and freedom. The Federalists proposed this and supported it. The Anti-Federalists consist of Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, Patrick Henry, and Samuel Adams. And the Federalists consisted of Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, John Jay, and Adams. In the economy, the Anti-Federalists were dominated by farmers in smaller rural communities, therefore having local power. The Federalists were dominated by big business interests and wanted the government to help regulate the economy. The Anti-Federalists felt that states were free agents that should manage their own revenue and spend their money as they see fit. However, the Federalists felt that many individual and different fiscal and monetary policies led to this economic struggle and national weakness, therefore favoring central banking and central financial policies. Now it's time to talk about Charles Beard, an author who published an economic interpretation of the Constitution of the United States. He argued that this Constitution was mainly produced and influenced by wealthy property owners, desired to create a strong government to protect their property rights. He also claimed that the Constitutional Convention was undemocratic because it was never voted upon by the general population, and if it did, states' laws would restrict such votes to white male landowners. In the video, please tell me what you thought about his theory. But now it's time to talk about a new federation. So let's go over the timeline. 1776, the Continental Congress approves the Declaration of Independence. 1 year later, in 1777, the Second Continental Congress drafts the Articles of Confederation. 1781, all 13 colonies finally decides to ratify these articles, but in 1887, the Congress meets again to revise and drafts the Constitution. 1 year later, 1788, the states ratify the Constitution of the United States. On June 21st, 1788, the Constitution was ratified when New Hampshire voted for its ratification. The ratification was secured when the Bill of Rights Amendment, the first 10, promised to be included. These rights were sometimes referred to as a Bill of Limits, due to the limiting the national government's power over civil liberties. These Bill of Rights amendments was adopted in 1791. The 10th Amendment would vest any power not specified to the national government to the states. Now let's talk about the articles. Articles 1 through 3 mainly refer to the legislative, executive, and judicial branch in that order. Article 4 is relation among the states. 5 is the process of the amendment. 6 is the national supremacy. And 7 being the ratification of progress, with the amendments 1 through 10 being the Bill of Rights, and any others after that being other amendments. Now, to amending the Constitution, to propose an amendment, you either need 2/3 of each House of Congress, or for 2/3 being proposed by a national convention, called upon by the Congress at the request of 2/3 of state legislators. Then you either need 3/4 of it to be ratified by state legislators, or 3/4 to be ratified by the state conventions. When it comes to altering it, you either have congressional legislation, the president can take action, it can be reviewed by the judicial branch, or it can interpret it, customize it, and use it however you see fit. Now let's go on to Chapter 3. Federalism. Alright, now it's time to talk about federalism. What is federalism? It's the principle of sharing tasks between the three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. The characteristics it has: constitutional parts like republic, states, etc. The federal constitution governs the relations between the federation and its lower parts. Any new policy activity is done by the federal government for all entities, and has a bicameral structure with one main government and one being the interest for governments. Regions may have their own constitution decrees and other laws on par with the federal government. They are also allowed to have their own flags, emblems, anthems, and other means of representation except sovereignty. Now, what are the different types? Unitary, confederal, and federal. Unitary is basically where the power is in the central government. In a confederal, the state governments have power, and in a federal, it kind of flows back and forth. Now, why do they choose federalism? They were afraid that Confederacy would end up breaking the Union of the United States. What were they against? Group domination, impeding progress, and eroded balance. While they wanted flexibility, a vital Congress, and recognition between local differences and interests. Now, what are the different types of powers? Enumerated, basically federal, stated in Article 1, Section 8. Reserved for the states in the 10th Amendment. And concurrent, which is basically what both have. But there are also some others, like police power, inherent power, and prohibited powers. Now let's go into defining the constitutional powers in the early years. Let's start with the first case, Marbury versus Madison in 1803, where it defined judicial review, constitutional interpretations, and the introduction to the president, or the executive branch. In the text of the Constitution, it shows the founders' intent, constructionism, and textualism. The real world talked about the executive and judicial branch, while constitutionality basically represented the legislative. Now it's time for the second case that started in 1819. McCulloch versus Maryland. This sustained the Supreme Clause. Last but not least is Gibbons versus Ogden in 1824, where they established Commerce Clause, Marshall's ruling, and that's about it. Now let's talk about the states' rights from the Civil War. They went to war for their rights and thought it would promote national and government growth. The Civil War also made way towards an amendment. Now, before we end it, let's talk about the two different types of federalism: dual and cooperative. You can basically think of them as a cake. Dual federalism is like a layer cake. It basically tells them their distinct roles in areas where they are supreme in. Therefore, they cannot cross over to the other side. Cooperative federalism is like a marble cake. It's all around. Both governments can cooperate on these issues and situations. And that'll be about it for my Unit 1 recap. Bye!